Welcome to Logic. I'm your host, Dr. Raymond Chang. Just 2 days ago, the Philippine government announced that the United States had been given access to 4 additional military bases in the Philippines, a key bit of access to the area, which would offer a much closer look to what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea and around the Taiwan Straits. Some critics say that the latest access given to the United States means that the Marcos government has tilted once again towards the United States, and which is just 1 month after President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.'s 3-day trip to China, which ended with some $22 billion in investment pledges from China, and during which some 14 bilateral deals were inked, ranging from agriculture, infrastructure, development cooperation, and tourism, etc., etc. And while the Malacanang also said that the Chinese President Xi Jinping affirmed his commitment to strengthen Philippines-China relations, could the most recent deal with the United States reversed such a deal? In this episode, we'll find it out. Now, from a geopolitical point of view, the recent access given to the United States regarding the 4 additional military bases in the Philippines helped stitch the gap in the arc of U.S. alliances stretching from South Korea and Japan in the north to Australia in the south. Now, this somehow seemed to have completed again the so-called first island of defense. Now, if that is the case, it could mean that the United States might be beefing up its military around China once again, not just in Japan, but also in the Philippines. And given the fact that the atmosphere near the Taiwan Straits is already tense, now remember how the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi triggered that tense military standoff in the region just last August. Now, some were just not quite comfortable with the U.S. military coming back to the Philippines. The deal to access these new military bases, after all, which in part reverses the United States' departure from the former colony more than 30 years ago in 1992, is no small matter. Now, in order to understand this deal, we really need to check some history. Now, the United States used to have 2 main military bases in the Philippines, the Subic Bay Naval Base and the Clark Air Force Base. Now, the time was 1989, and the then Ronald Reagan administration was confronted with a set of apparently contradictory problems. How to close the unneeded military bases in its territory, because there seems to be no immediate need for military conflict in the region, especially when China, they were just opening up and started its market reform in 1984, and how to retain its important military facilities and installations in the Philippines. Now, studies were done by various United States government agencies, and they came to the conclusion that the Defense Department could save from $1 to $5 billion annually by closing some of the unneeded bases out of a total of 3,800, all located in various parts of the United States. Now, according to the United States, China obviously wasn't a threat at that time. So, on one hand, you have the Pentagon officials and key members of the United States Congress wanting to close them down. I mean, the Subic Bay Naval Base and the Clark Air Base. And on the other hand, policymakers in Washington still consider the 2 U.S. bases in the Philippines as, the irreducible minimum of American security and interest in the Pacific and the Far East. So why did they eventually leave? It's probably mostly, if not all, about money. Now, indeed, negotiations to review the Military Bases Agreement, or MBA, originally signed in 1947, has undergone more than 40 amendments in 4 decades from 1947 all the way to 1989. And the negotiations in 1990 were significant because it involves the extension of the term of the agreement that expires in 1991. Now, the Philippine government wanted a stunning $825 million a year for a period of 7 years. But the United States government would not budge from the earlier agreed $360 million per year for 10 years. Now, that is more than a 56% off what the Philippine government wanted. So you might say that's a huge difference, but why did the Philippine government ask for that in the first place? That's because this was not the first time such a hike was demanded by the Philippines. Now, back in 1984, a similar hike had been asked and given for the Clark Air Base. Of course, that was the time when the Soviet-Afghan War took place from 1979 to 1989. So if you remember the story of, Rambo 3, the Hollywood blockbuster that depicts events, fictional events of course, during the Soviet-Afghan War, then You see, the timing was just right for that price hike in 1984. But this time in 1990, the US government did not agree. So the Clark Air Base was closed in 1991 and the Subic Bay Naval Base was closed in 1992. Now, the US withdrawal from Subic, now in case you don't know, the Subic base is actually so big, about the size of the entire Singapore. Now, the whole thing marked the first time since the 16th century that no foreign military forces were present in the Philippines. And in terms of the Filipinos' national pride thing, presence of foreign military bases and troops in the sovereign country of the Philippines has always remained a very sensitive issue. And only after more than 3 decades since the signing of the Military Bases Agreement, that MBA thing back in 1947, the Filipinos finally got their sovereignty formally extended over the US military bases in the islands. And the Filipino flags began to fly in the US base areas only since 1979. Now that explains a lot. Now, so for nationalist Filipinos, they continue to ask this question. Is national sovereignty compatible with American military presence on their soil? Are not these bases likely to invite attacks from America's adversaries? Now, is Philippines' interest being served by the US maintenance of bases on the islands, or is it just the US interests being served? So, for some Filipinos, they raised similar questions as well, way back in the 1940s, but they did enter into a military bases agreement with the Americans, by virtue of which the US military presence is still continuing in the Philippine Islands. So then, from 1990 onwards, nothing happened. Was China not a threat back then? But you know, the Americans actually had to put in the military resources in other places. For example, they were just back from Panama, which they invaded from mid-December 1989 to late January 1990. And then they were preparing for Desert Storm, which lasted from August 1990 to February 1991. Now you see, their focus back then just wasn't China, yet. Now, but then after Beijing Olympics in 2008, everybody saw that new China, or the rise of China. And then came the era of President Barack Obama. So Obama's grand strategy was what the United States needed after George W. Bush years. It promoted some necessary adjustment and recalibration of US leadership, at least from their point of view, and better oriented America to address enormous long-term challenges such as the rise of China. Now, so it's natural, supposedly, that the United States, wants their bases back again in the Philippines. So negotiation of these bases started in 2014, during which the times of Obama, which was 8 to 9 years ago. So you see how early they started the discussion. And they sort of arrive at a deal which mainly provides for the United States to deploy forces to Philippines based on a rotational basis. And it wasn't until 2016 that the Philippine Supreme Court ruled that the so-called Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, ACCA, between the Philippines and the United States is an executive agreement that does not require Senate approval. Now, with this ruling in hand, the Philippines and the United States government can begin in earnest to implement the 2014 deal, which mainly provides for the United States to deploy forces to Philippines bases on a rotational basis, pre-position humanitarian response and defense material in the country, and of course, upgrade infrastructure within Philippine bases for these purposes. Now, in the times of Obama's first visit to Manila and in the shadow of growing tensions of China in South China Sea, the late President Noynoy Aquino's government intended for ACCA to actually complement the Philippines' rebooted military modernization effort. And even though President Duterte didn't seem to like the idea, this has actually been ongoing from 2014 to now. So if you think the access granting thing is something that appeared only after the Russia-Ukraine war, you're probably wrong. Whether the United States' idea of coming back to Asia was at least planned some 8 years ago. So when the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., visited China last month and agreed to handle disputes peacefully and boosted cooperation with China, that says something about the president's real plan. Now, and note the timing, okay? Now, he was in China first, met the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and then released the access granting news only after a month. Now remember that I just said, nationalist Filipinos continue to ask that question. Is national sovereignty compatible with American military presence on their soil? And are not these bases likely to invite attacks from America's adversaries? Now, if you read the news about President Marcos visiting China carefully, he even talked about his meeting with the late Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong. Now, that historical connection between the Filipinos and the Chinese says it all. The Chinese as a friend, not a fall. And because of that, his visit ended with some very fruitful 22.8 billion of investment pledges from China and some 14 bilateral deals. So, to President Marcos, war or military conflict is obviously not imminent. What is important is the livelihood of the Philippine people and the development of his country. And he knows exactly why the US wants to be there this time. So mind you, where cities like Subic and Clark, where US military bases once were, both prospered. So Clark is now going to become the international hub, and Subic is now a free port zone and a beach resort. Now, Filipinos want Americans to help develop two cities, so that when they leave again, they will be leaving behind an upgraded city for the Filipinos. And the fact that both the former Philippine President Duterte and the current President Marcos don't want weapons to be loaded at these ports might help explain this. And if this doesn't satisfy you, the mere fact that it took the Philippine government some 20 years just to clean up the Subic port as a result of the Americans leaving asbestos, toxic stuff everywhere, clearly explain why this peace-loving nation wants no weapons loaded, and that the United States is only using these new bases to pre-position humanitarian response and defense material in the country, and, yes, of course, upgrade infrastructure within the Philippine bases for these purposes. So whether the Philippines could become a new Asian neutral zone, well, without declaring neutrality, of course, is unclear. But the fact that they know China is not a foe is for sure. So, until then, ciao!
Before you leave, please be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with your friends. See you in the next episode!